you think about it, if you're heating a lot of particles before you even get to the ground, you've done a lot of heating before you get to heat the ground, and that's a stabilizing thing. When you heat from the top and not as much from the bottom, then that's a stabilizing factor. So that's why, for example, in Ghana, Africa, the sun comes right overhead. It's an equatorial sun, but there's two things playing into it. It's kind of a slightly humid environment. Also, the air is just often so dirty from the Sahara dust and another pollution that it just doesn't feel like, it's not the rip and thermals you expect from the sun passing directly overhead. It just those two things kind of mellow it out. And sometimes you want that. Sometimes you want things to be mellow. You don't want, if you're in the high mountain desert, really strong sun, really blue skies, things can be cranking by 9 a.m. and just ballistic by noon. So okay, let's see. Okay, so now that was kind of weather stuff and basics. I want to go a little bit into the flying concepts. So cross-country flying in many ways is no different than just bumbling around at your home site, but there's a bit of a leap to be made. It's kind of a lot of it is mental, but some is also, it's worth having certain skills before you leave the nest, before you decide to go on your first cross country. And something you could practice at your home site or at a coastal site, probably best at a coastal ridge soaring site at first, is what I've called precarious landing practice. Is basically don't always land on something that's flat. Practice a side hill landing. Maybe if it's a sand dune or a slope that's clear where you can land, or if you don't want to set your wing down in that, practice a touch and go run through. Like, okay, I can side hill land on this. Maybe it's just ice plant covered and you don't want to get your wing into it, but just to touch through, kind of, okay, if I wanted to, I could have been putting it down here. Okay, now run a few steps, run it out, or even these kind of barren hillsides. I'm not sure what the regs are out there at Levin, but hillsides like this, if you should feel comfortable being able to put it down on a hillside. You should also try to evaluate from the air what's so steep that if I land on it, it's likely that I'm gonna go rolling down that hillside, because certain things from above look flat, but they're actually pretty steep. So if you do decide to land there, you want to make sure that you can walk out of there. But you want to have practice landing in areas that are not just big open flat fields, because once you commit to the cross country flight, you're gonna want to have some good landing zones in mind. But sometimes those landing zones, great landing hillsides, especially for paragliders, make really good landing zones. We don't have to quite do the fly on a wall of a hang glider when it comes to a hillside, but understanding that fly on a wall concept, not necessarily going straight downwind uphill, but we can kind of side hill swoop up a hillside, can be really nice. Also, a hillside a much smaller area can act as a much longer landing zone on a hillside, because you can effectively, you set up for the bottom part of it, but then you can kind of swoop up at last minute if you're overshooting, and it's an effectively much larger area if it's on a hillside. Then you'd need a much longer strip on the flat than you would on the hillside to be able to land it. And then if you are side hill landing, if ideally you've evaluated which way, if there's a crosswind component, you go into the upwind. You're setting up upwind. The other thing is, it's hard to leave your site because you kind of that's the LZ. If you've always taught, okay, this is the landing zone, I kind of call it like LZ suck. Like it's kind of a mental thing to break. Like, okay, that doesn't have to be my LZ. Like, I can go somewhere else. Also, if the hills are working great here over which is considered my flying site, kind of like realizing, well, if it works great here, why isn't it working? Like, why wouldn't the next hill over work? Just because that's not my flying site, but just realizing if it works great here, the day's probably, the next hill over is feeling the same day that the flying site is, so you might want to try heading over there. Now, keeping kind of a cone of landing zone options. I like to think of it as a cone. The cone is defined by your glide ratio, and then it gets skewed by the wind. So the higher you are, that cone, first think zero wind. So this it's an effect that cone is from you to the ground, and on the ground you've got this effective circle of like, this is as far as I can get to. And so as you're flying, you always have to evaluate as you're moving along. Okay, this is my, say it's very light wind conditions, this is my circle on the ground. As I'm getting lower, that circle's quickly shrinking. And as you're higher, then you got more options. It's getting to be a bigger circle. Within that circle, you've got to be constantly scanning, what are my landing options? Is that field, would that work? Okay, was there any obstacles? What, if that didn't work, where would I go? It's kind of thinking a few steps ahead, but it's really always, put most simply, it's always keeping a usable landing zone in mind. And what's a usable landing zone depends partly on your skills, partly if you've done some precarious landing practice. Then certain things that might not look like a landing zone to one might be a fine landing zone to you. But that's for everyone to decide on their flying skills. The other thing to avoid is landing denial. I find that sometimes I have landing denial. It's not good to spend your whole flight thinking about landing, because that might lead to landing. Where if you're thinking of flying and thinking of the next thermal, looking at like all the lift sources, that's definitely the way to have an extended cross-country flight. But the flip side of that is don't have landing denial, because then as you shrink that circle of options, you suddenly might have forced yourself into a really stupid landing area where that really wasn't necessary. That was just because you were in landing denial. So try to avoid what I call landing denial. Now back to that cone, it's going to shift drastically as you have wind. That circle is going to become kind of more elliptical, and the upwind edge of it might be not very far upwind from where you are, whereas it'll stretch quite a ways downwind. And keep in mind with the valley winds, things can change down in the valley. So you could have a certain valley where it could possibly be things could have gotten a lot windier while you were in the air. Once you start doing multi-hour cross-country flights, things could have developed a lot, and the wind on the ground could be stronger than your flying speed. If it comes to that, it's not the end of the world, but you want to suddenly, you're no longer looking upwind for your landing areas, you're looking downwind. Where are you going to back into? What's going to be, and at that point, you got to really be mindful of turbulence. The most open, ideally the most green, like a big alfalfa field. If you're out in the Owens somewhere or something, just a big long alfalfa field that you might be able to back into. Hopefully, the greener, wetter areas are less likely to have thermals coming off of them than the drier areas. So that would be a good place to put down and to be able to, even if you have to back in. And I found sometimes at touchdown, 1A and a lot of brake, or a 1A and one rear riser, kind of asymmetrically, kind of disables the wing very, very quickly. But there's other techniques. That's just one I've kind of found for myself. Ideally, try not to get into that, but it just to kind of have some of these things in mind. How would you, having thought about it, how you would approach it, and of course, doing some ground handling. You're never too advanced of a pilot to do a lot of ground handling with your glider. If it's windy out, it's a great time to kind of learn how you would deal with the wing in pretty strong wind, especially if you've got a place that's relatively safe where you're not going to get dragged into something.
There's no rule, but you can't do a nice parachute landing fall. I do it probably 80-85% of the time. And you're flying for maybe 2-3 hours, whatever. And you're coming into a little tight spot. You don't have to do a nice little dandified landing. It doesn't matter. Just do a nice little parachute landing fall, so you're safe. Just have a throw down. I do it most of the time. And sure, maybe you don't have to, but have a strong sense of self-preservation. So that's really.
So one thing speaking of turbulence, one thing I want to mention, often when you see in like, books like for flying and stuff, or it's often described as like a swirl. But turbulence is really these snaky vortex tubes that can that spin up, and then they kind of contort like these weird snakes, and they shed their energy to ever smaller vortex tubes until they dissipate eventually as viscosity. But the stretching of these vortex tubes can momentarily like really amp up the spin in them. So a great little vortex tubes that's often coming off the wingtips, and a heavily loaded tandem sheds a really nice little vortex tube, and you just feel that go right through your glider. If you've ever flown in the lee of a tandem, especially if they got a heavy passenger, you won't forget it. Now, people are nowadays with modern gliders, some people coming out of spiral dives are able to hit their own vortex tubes on the way up, and those can have actually, I think, caused some people issues, because being heavily loaded on a solo glider, you can carve pretty good wingtip vortices, and if you fly right back up into it, especially if you're kind of at a funny angle of attack, that might not be the best time. This kind of sucks if you wake yourself, if you have an accident because of a turbulence you made yourself. That's kind of a bummer. So keep that in mind a little bit. But in general, turbulence is a very 3D feature. It's not so 2D as we always kind of see this nice little swirl drawn. And wind turbulence is often much greater than thermal turbulence. By the time thermal turbulence gets to be really strong, just pure thermals, those are some pretty ripping strong thermals. It's rare that if there's no wind that the thermals are producing such strong turbulence to make it, locally, yes, they can make some uncomfortable turbulence, but really wind is the one that you got to be really careful of. I just find, just being aware where the wind's coming from, and not putting yourself in the immediate lee of things, realizing, okay, smooth curve hills are less likely to have really harsh turbulence. Any sharp features can have really sharp turbulence. If you've ever flown Cheetah and it turns a little bit north and you're coming into the Cheetah Bowl, there's a perfect place to find some really wicked turbulence. I'm not saying go there, but if you've stumbled into it, you'll know it. It's that point that makes Cheetahs a very sharp feature, and the wind turns a little north and it'll just shred a really tight little kind of sideways rotor. So very sharp features, just got to be really aware of that. And then back, as I was talking about, valley winds and on a cross-country flight aren't necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of nice to know you can use a lot of these side valleys, as if you're going to have a low save in a valley. There's a lot of these tributary valleys. You can often use the valley wind to ridge soar up, wait for a thermal, and then get out of that valley wind again and continue on your flight. Being aware, though, that anytime you're ridge soaring something when there's thermals ripping through it, it's a totally different story than coastal ridge soaring. Coastal ridge soaring is great because coastal ridge soaring, you really get to learn how the wind interacts with the terrain minus the thermals. So you learn wind, you learn how the river works. Thermals are how the air boils, and then when you have windy thermal conditions, it's a boiling river, and that gets to be infinitely complex. It's really, it gets hard to imagine exactly what's happening, and you just have to, any kind of soaring near the terrain when there's thermals ripping through is much more dangerous soaring than just coastal ridge soaring. So ideally on a cross-country flight, you don't have to do it too much, and then you just have to be really careful. You have to kind of make that personal assessment. Is this too much wind? Is this too rough? How close can I be getting? And you are exposed. Anytime you're really close to the terrain, there's that much less time to fix it if something does go south. So keep that in mind. But that said, the valley wind can kind of help, under the right conditions, help you get a low save and then get back up into the thermals that are above the valley wind. Okay. And I think the last thing I want to say, and I'll let Martin and Ed talk, is evaluating your confidence. Like in my early years, I found I went through pretty large cycles of like overly confident and like unnecessarily scared, and it just